Hi guys, and welcome to another video with your favorite German girl Eva. And today we're going to react to a video about how the British robbed India. I honestly don't know that much about Indian history, but I do know that India used to be the world's #1 GDP country before the British took over. So today we're going to learn more about Indian history and get more educated about this kind of topic. I'll leave the original video link down below if you guys want to check it out. And thanks to all these people who commented and subscribed on my last video. And if you want your name to appear in my next video, then don't forget to comment and subscribe. And now let's get right into the video.
In the year 1700, India's share in the world's economy was an astounding 27%, more than all of Europe combined. 250 years later, India's share had dropped to less than 3%, and its people were left impoverished. What happened? Strap in, adventurers. We're about to dive into a dark and messy history. Welcome to 18th century India. In 1707 CE, the death of Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb sends the empire into a decades-long spiral. In his wake, an endless parade of weak princelings forced themselves upon the peacock throne. With the Mughal Empire teetering on the brink of collapse, regional powers jostle for supremacy. Land grabs and title claims, infighting and betrayal. India is vulnerable. The situation is so precarious that in 1739, Persian Emperor Nadir Shah invades North India and sacks Delhi. During this period of disorder, the British sensed opportunity. Leveraging their unique advantages as a foreign power, they bribed and blasted their way into a dominant position in the subcontinent. India was no stranger to dealing with foreign aggression, but the British were not like those who had come before. They were not like Nadir Shah, who looted and simply left. Nor were they like the Huns, who, while shedding Gupta blood, became Indian themselves. Yes, the British were different, for they saw India as an inexhaustible gold mine, whose resources were to be forever extracted. By the time India won its independence in 1947, its native institutions had been demolished, its economy de-industrialized, its trade networks severed, and its people more deeply divided by caste and creed. In just 200 years of colonial rule, the India that once inspired the world was unmade. The halcyon days of India are over. She has been drained of all the wealth she once possessed, and her energies have been cramped by a sordid system of misrule. The deliberate bleeding of India by the British was so extreme that famed American scholar Will Durant referred to it as the greatest crime in all of history. So let's pull back the curtain and see what India was like before colonialism. In the 19th century, the American J.T. Sunderland wrote about the India that the British found when they arrived. India was a far greater industrial and manufacturing nation than any in Europe or Asia. Her textile goods were famous all over the civilized world. So was her exquisite jewelry and her precious stones. So was her pottery, her porcelains and ceramics. So were her fine works in metal, iron, steel, silver, and gold. She had great architecture, equal in beauty to any in the world. She had great merchant—
Oh, wait. Oh my goodness. I've seen pictures of like ancient Indian buildings before, and they looked so amazing, so beautiful. During that time back then, India architecture really was ahead of everyone.
businessmen, bankers, and financiers. She was not only a great shipbuilding nation, but had commerce and trade which extended to all civilized countries. That may seem like heavy-handed praise, but the record does show that pre-colonial India was a dominant manufacturing economy. Let's take a closer look at the textile, shipbuilding, and metalworking industries. India was a textile superpower for most of its long history. There were many textile centers in the subcontinent. Coastal Andhra was a block printing hub, for example, while Gujarat and Bengal were known for their high-end woven products. There was global demand for these items. In fact, India enjoyed a mind-blowing 25% share of the global textile trade by the mid-18th century. This thriving textile trade had knock-on effects for the entire economy. For example, the popularity of Indian textiles led to the creation of stable international distribution networks. By piggybacking on these networks, other Indian artisans could sell their goods worldwide at a reduced cost. As a result, many different industries flourished alongside the Indian textile industry.
Oh, I didn't know
We know that international trade was conducted primarily along maritime routes, and so the Indian shipbuilding industry had developed into a behemoth too. A significant number of Indian ports were engaged in the shipbuilding industry. Dhaka, Mausalapatnam, Surat, Calicut, Quilon, and many, many others. Entire rural communities were involved in the production and processing of materials used to construct ships. Quality was paramount. Consider the Bengali merchant fleet in the early 17th century. The fleet consisted of nearly 5,000 ships, each capable of carrying up to 500 tons of goods. These ships were constructed in Bengali ports by native artisans who had the skills to craft elaborate wood, iron, and brass fittings. According to one British maritime observer, Indian vessels combine elegance and utility and are models of fine workmanship. Merchant contracts indicate that Bengali ships were much more durable than English ships. Bengali ships had an average lifespan exceeding 20 years, while English ships were not known to last more than 12. Quite a difference.
Huge difference.
India was a longtime pioneer in the global steel industry. As early as the 6th century CE, crucible-formed steel, which came to be known as Wootz or Damascus steel in the West, was being produced for export by Indian blacksmiths, particularly along the Malabar coast and in the Deccan. Arab and European officers regularly imported blades from India. While these blades were purchased as wartime implements, they were so robust and beautifully crafted that they also served as a mark of high status in times of peace. Though we've barely scratched the surface, it should already be clear that India was a manufacturing juggernaut, a thriving exporter of high-quality goods to markets throughout the world. How did the British manage to unmake all of that? The fundamental principle of the British has been to make the whole Indian nation subservient to the interests and benefits of themselves. And so, once the British took power, they changed the entire dynamic of the Indian economy to suit their own interests. The first imposed an absurdly harsh 80% tariff. This had an immediate catch-22 trap effect. Exporting goods from India to the UK was now economically unviable. But remember, Indians were restricted from selling to anyone else. Similar restrictions were imposed on nearly—
What? I mean, why? Okay, that is crazy. Why are the British acting like India's jealous, insecure ex or something? That is so insane. So just because their products weren't good enough, they just made sure India just cannot make good products anymore? That is crazy. And isn't that super inefficient too? Would it make more sense for themselves to like support the better quality products instead of like just completely destroying it? What the? That is.
nearly
I did
every
not know
branch
that.
of manufacturing in India. India was reduced to being a mere exporter of raw materials, like cotton and metal ore, so that the British could sell finished products back to Indians at a premium. We conquered India as an outlet for the goods of Britain. I'm not such a hypocrite to say that we hold India for the Indians. The colonial de-industrialization process was so complete that by 1947, only 0.7% of India was employed in any form of manufacturing. But skilled workers had to go somewhere, do something. The British monopoly on industrial production drove Indian artisans, merchants, builders, and others into agriculture en masse. In the words of Dr. Charles Hall, India's population has been thrown back upon the soil because Britain's discriminating duties have ruined every branch of native manufacture. Rural wages cratered to historical lows, and in fact, the land itself could not sustain the influx of newly disenfranchised workers. Poor seasonal harvests and droughts gave way to catastrophic famines and mass poverty. With most Indians now converted into peasant cultivators, the British sought to exploit them further. They began to tax
What,
cultivators
even
as the
more?
primary revenue source for the administration. Taxes were extreme, pegged at 50 to 80% of gross income, and calculated before.
Okay, hold up. No wonder Indians hate the West. This is insane. So all the skilled people just had to work on farms and basically will live like, I don't know, slaves or poor people. That is that is so
the
bad.
harvest. The result? Indian cultivators often owed more in taxes than they earned as income. The British knew how harsh this really was. They openly conceded that they were imposing the highest tax rates in the world, and that taxes were more than 3 times higher than they had ever been under Indian rulers. To add
Like,
insult to injury, the British even bragged about it in Parliament.
they bragged about it. What? Didn't anyone stop them back then? How could they just do that to India without anyone saying anything? Is there some law or some rule that says they can't do that? That is so cruel. Oh
The
my
Indians
goodness.
have been taxed to the utmost limit. Every province has been made a field for higher exaction, and it has always been our boast how greatly we have raised the revenue above that which the native rulers were able to extract.
They just completely exploited them and just took taking all their money. Like, it's bad enough that they completely stopped the exports and stuff like that, but then raise taxes and stuff like that? How are the people supposed to survive?
Colonial taxes were so burdensome that 2/3 of the population in directly ruled British areas fled to the hinterlands, where native Indian lords could at least minimally protect them from financial depredation. The millions who stayed behind could hardly afford to pay taxes, and the situation was worsened by the fact that the British did not
That's
negotiate
crazy.
tax payments. Horrors were perpetrated under the guise of sinless mathematical neutrality. Tax defaulters were confined in cages and exposed to the burning sun. Fathers sold their children to meet the rising
What?
rates. Vulnerable peasants were physically tortured to pay up, and when they didn't have the means to pay, the British confiscated their farmland for themselves. Tens of millions of landless peasants were created for the first time in Indian history. By
What? What even is their goal? Like, isn't that super inefficient too? Like, they just destroying India and like completely destroying the people living there. Isn't that super stupid? Like, if they kind of want to exploit the country, wouldn't it be smarter to make sure the people there are happy and like are good and well?
the end of the 19th century, India was Britain's
They had to
largest
go through
source of
so
revenue by
much.
far, its largest purchaser of exports, and a source of highly paid employment for both British civil servants and soldiers, and they were all paid for by Indian taxes. Many British officials freely acknowledged the exploitative nature of the colonial enterprise. In fact, a Prime Minister of the UK,
Why are they
the
so
Marquess of
greedy?
Salisbury, himself admitted, as India is to be bled of money, the lancet should be directed to those parts where the blood is congested. And just like that, India and its people were bled dry. The fundamental
What?
issue of British overlordship was the fact that the British had no intention to become one with the land or to rule it as their own. The British saw India as innately and eternally foreign, and this justified their creation and maintenance of what scholars have referred to as an extractive colony. For comparison's sake, consider the Turkic peoples who invaded India and eventually formed the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire. Look, the Mughals were no heroes. They imposed unequal taxes, engaged in religious discrimination, plundered local treasuries, visited great violence upon their enemies, and exhibited a Persianized racial arrogance. But one thing is clear: India's wealth was preserved at a foundational level. After nearly 2 centuries of Mughal rule, India was still a dominant economic power, responsible for 27% of global trade. There's a simple reason for that. See, the Mughals had a foreign place of origin, Fergana, but they did not repatriate India's resources to their original homeland. India may not have been Fergana, but it had become their new home, and so their loyalties and energies were owed solely to India. Meanwhile, the British ruled India as disconnected tyrants. The bulk of the revenue from India wasn't reinvested in India. No, no, no. It was extracted and repatriated to their distant, foggy homeland. How much?
Yeah, but doesn't that make zero sense? Because they can't if they say their goal is to infinitely exploit India, wouldn't isn't it super stupid and to just destroy it and make sure it's not successful and like good anymore? that is so stupid. How can they be so greedy and like so selfish?
Modern economists have estimated that the total amount of wealth that the British extracted from India is in the ballpark of $43 trillion.
What?
Yes,
$43 trillion? How? They don't even need that much money. What? That is crazy. And they didn't think for a second that with so much revenue they could at least make sure the people in India are like okay and don't have to suffer and like just die. What? Why? How could that just happen? How did no one stop them from doing that? That's
$3 trillion.
crazy.
When taxes are not spent in the country from which they are raised, they constitute an absolute loss and extinction of the whole amount withdrawn from the tax country. The money might as well be thrown into the sea. Such is the nature of the tribute we have so long exacted from India.
What?
Apologists for colonial rule often point to the railways as some sort of extravagant counter to the argument of extraction and divestment. But as modern scholars have pointed out, the railways serve as evidence for how exploitative and inefficient British investment in India really was. First, there's the bold assumption that Indians would not have built railways, like the Japanese or others, either by importing the technology or by developing their own. India had been far too advanced and cutting edge of civilization to not keep up had it been given the opportunity to do so. When the British came to India, the country was the leader of Asiatic civilization. Japan was nowhere. Now, in 50 years, Japan has revolutionized her history with the aid of modern arts of progress, and India, burdened by 150 years of English rule, is condemned to tutelage. But let's ignore that for now. Initially, the Indian railways were positioned as a grand investment scheme for British shareholders. The government guaranteed substantial returns of at least 5% per year, and when the revenues were not enough to pay out these returns, Indian taxpayers covered all the losses. Because of these taxpayer-backed guarantees, construction of the railways was extremely inefficient. Here's a fun stat. Every mile of Indian rail cost £18,000 to construct, as compared to £2,000 for the same mile built in the United States.
Oh, that is so much more.
All the elements of railway construction, steel, wagons, gears, engines, and more, were produced by British manufacturers. Indians weren't even given an opportunity to produce their own manufactured alternatives because the British government imposed restrictions that prevented Indians from competing. Worse still, the essential purpose of the railways was to assist the British enterprise in the exploitation of the natural resources of India. In fact,
that is literally proving my point. Like, that is just so stupid. What even is their goal? If they're like trains are really important for them, then wouldn't it make sense to help India, like at least make them cheaper or something? Like, they're just mindlessly exploiting it without thinking about anything.
the railways made it possible for the British to export enormous amounts of grain and other agricultural products, which sparked and exacerbated famines. Over the course of British rule in India, an estimated 35 million preventable deaths were caused by famines. That's millions more than those killed under Stalin or Mao, and that's 5 times more than the Holocaust. The British—
Oh, damn. That comparison is crazy. So much more than like Holocaust and all of those things.
Were directly responsible for this. They mass exported Indian foodstuffs to Britain and other countries in Europe, even during drought periods. Food in India became too expensive for peasants to afford. According to Dr. Charles Hall, India starves so that its annual tax revenue to England may not be diminished by $1. There's plenty of grain in India. The trouble is that the people have been ground down till they are too poor to buy it. The British had no interest in provisioning for Indian lives. Famine non-intervention was official government policy. How ironic, given that heavy-handed British intervention and market manipulation is what sparked the famines in the first place. And when good people, Indians and foreigners, worked together to help famine-affected peasants, the British government made efforts to stop them. They were furious that the government—
To stop them? What? What even is Britain's goal here? What the hell? That is so stupid. They're literally acting like some child or something. So just cause people are trying to make the things better for the Indians or like try to fix their mistakes, they're just gonna make them stop so no one like pays attention to that. That is so stupid and like just so it makes no sense.
His own failures were being highlighted. Don't believe me? Listen to this British officer in his own words. Scores of corpses were tumbled into old wells because the deaths were too numerous for the relatives to perform funeral rites. Mothers sold their children for a single meal. Husbands flung their wives into ponds to escape the torment of seeing them perish from hunger. But amid these scenes of death, the British government in India was unmoved. Newspapers were persuaded into silence. Strict orders were given to civilians. Do not acknowledge that civilians are dying of hunger.
What? So Britain is just ignoring all of that and they're just being super stubborn and just want as much money as they can. And just ignoring that there are people's lives at stake, that there are people suffering. Like, I mean, all of that is literally bad enough. Like, it's really, really, really bad enough. But it also just makes no sense at the same time. Why would they even do that? It's like so counterproductive too. They could at least help India to be like become greater or like still be successful and like maybe benefit off of that or something or they could like help them and not like completely destroy their whole economy because in at the same time it's just gonna not be beneficial for them. That is so stupid. I don't
And if you
get why
think
they
that
would do
Indians would
that.
have done a worse job, consider this. There hasn't been a single large-scale Indian famine in the 70-plus years since British rule ended. Not one. Independent India has its flaws, but it has been overwhelmingly better at providing for the care, safety, and prosperity of its own people. And now you know.
I did not know all of that. Why was Britain being so cruel back then? And how did no one stop them? That is that is so sad. I did not know all of that. It's actually that was so true what the dude said at the beginning of the video. That is literally such a huge crime. Probably the biggest crime in history. Why would they even do that? Well, guys, this video was really informative and actually kind of eye-opening too. Anytime we hear about India in the news, it's always kind of in a bad way or in a negative way. So this video really provided a whole new perspective on India. Well, guys, that was my reaction to this video on Indian history. And if you guys love my content, then don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see you guys in another video. Bye bye!